The morning light was a pale, watery gray, seeping through the heavy curtains of Claire's bedroom. She lay in bed, the sheets a tangled mess around her, evidence of a night that felt like a dream. Thomas was already up, his side of the bed cold, his absence a stark reminder of the life she was supposed to lead. She turned her head, the pillow still carrying the faint scent of the stranger's cologne, a silent whisper of last night's indiscretion. Her heart thudded with a mix of guilt and exhilaration as she remembered his touch, the way his voice had murmured promises against her skin. She knew she should feel remorse, but all she could feel was the echo of his kiss, the thrill of the forbidden. The door creaked open and Thomas entered, his face set in the usual lines of preoccupation. "Good morning, Claire," he said, his voice devoid of suspicion, just the routine greeting of a man too wrapped up in his own world to notice the storm brewing in hers. "Good morning," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. She watched him as he dressed, his movements precise and predictable. He was a good man, she reminded herself, but the thought was hollow, overshadowed by the memory of another's hands on her. As Thomas left for his daily business, Claire rose, her body still tingling with the remnants of last night's passion. She dressed quickly, her mind racing. She needed to see him again to understand what this meant, what she wanted. The streets were less forgiving in the daylight, the rain now a drizzle that misted her face as she made her way to the address he had whispered in her ear before leaving. The house was modest, not what she expected, tucked away in a part of London where the elite seldom ventured. Her heart pounded as she approached the door, her breath catching in her throat. She knocked softly, the sound barely audible over the patter of rain. The door opened almost immediately, as if he had been waiting for her. There he stood, his dark hair still damp, his eyes alight with a mix of surprise and something more profound, something that made her pulse quicken. "Claire," he breathed, his voice a caress that sent a shiver down her spine. "I didn't expect you so soon." "I couldn't stay away," she admitted, stepping inside. The room was small, filled with books and papers, a stark contrast to the opulence of her own home. It smelled of ink and old leather, a scent that seemed to wrap around her like a cloak. He closed the door behind her, the click of the latch echoing in the quiet space. "I'm glad you came," he said, his gaze intense, searching. "We need to talk." She nodded, her resolve firming. "Yes, we do." Her eyes roamed over the room, taking in the details of his life, a life so different from hers. "Who are you really?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He moved closer, his presence overwhelming in the confined space. "My name is Alexander. Not what you'd expect. I work with words, not wealth. I write for a living." The revelation was both surprising and fitting. His eloquence, the way he had spoken to her last night, it all made sense now. "And what do you write?" she inquired, her curiosity piqued. "Stories mostly. Tales of love, loss, and everything in between." He paused, his eyes holding hers. "I've been inspired by many things, but none quite like you." The air between them thickened, charged with unspoken desires and the weight of their actions. Claire felt the pull towards him, the same magnetic force that had drawn her here despite the risks. "Alexander," she started, her voice trembling. "What happened last night? It can't happen again. It shouldn't have happened at all." He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch her arm. "But it did, Claire. And I believe it was meant to. We can't undo what's been done, but we can decide what happens next." Her heart warred within her, loyalty to Thomas, the thrill of Alexander's touch, the fear of discovery, and the allure of passion. "I'm married," she whispered, the words sounding more like a plea than a statement. "I know," he replied, his thumb stroking her skin, sending sparks through her. "But sometimes life isn't just about what we should do, but what we need." The room seemed to close in around them, the rain outside a distant memory as they stood there, the tension palpable. Claire knew she should leave, return to her life of propriety and predictability, but the desire to stay, to explore this forbidden path, was overwhelming. "Alexander, Her words were cut off as he leaned in, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was both a question and an answer. It was softer than the night before, filled with a tender urgency that spoke of longing and the fear of loss. When they parted, she was breathless, her mind a whirl of confusion and clarity. I need time, she managed to say, her voice shaky. Time to think. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Take all the time you need. But remember, Claire, life is fleeting, and sometimes the heart knows what it wants before the mind does. The days that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions for Claire. Each morning, she awoke with the weight of her decisions pressing down on her. The scent of Alexander's cologne still lingering in her mind like a forbidden perfume. Thomas, ever the dutiful husband, remained oblivious to the storm within her. His routine as unchanging as the ticking of their grandfather clock. Claire found herself at the window more often, watching the rain that seemed to mirror her internal turmoil. She would trace the droplets with her finger, each one a reminder of the night she had crossed into a world of passion and secrecy. Her days were filled with the mundane tea with friends, overseeing the household, attending to her social obligations, but her nights were haunted by the memory of Alexander's touch, his words, his promise of a life less ordinary. One evening, as the city was draped in the soft glow of twilight, Claire received a letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet it sent a thrill through her. She opened it with trembling hands, the paper crisp and scented faintly of ink and leather, just like Alexander's study. Claire, I find myself unable to cease thinking of you. Your presence has become a muse, an inspiration that compels me to write, to live. I understand your need for time, but time is a luxury we might not have. Meet me at the old bridge by the river at midnight. There's something I must show you, something that might change everything. Alexander. Her heart raced as she read his words. The bridge was a secluded spot, known to few, where the city's noise faded into the gentle rush of the Thames. She knew she shouldn't go, but the pull was irresistible, like a moth to a flame. That night, under the cloak of darkness, Claire slipped out of her home, her heart pounding with the thrill of the clandestine. The streets were deserted, the gas lamps casting long shadows that danced with her every step. The bridge came into view, an old structure that whispered of times past, its arches framing the moonlit river. Alexander was already there, his figure a silhouette against the night. He turned as she approached, his eyes reflecting the moonlight, filled with a mix of hope and trepidation. Claire, he greeted, his voice low, almost lost in the sound of the water below. Thank you for coming. She nodded, her breath catching in her throat. What did you want to show me? He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation she took it, feeling the warmth of his skin against hers. He led her to the center of the bridge, where he stopped and turned to face her. Look, he said, pointing towards the city. From this vantage point, London was a tapestry of light and shadow, the river reflecting the stars above. This is where I come when I need to think, to escape. It's where I feel most alive. Claire looked out, the beauty of the scene momentarily distracting her from her inner conflict. It's beautiful, she murmured. It's not just the view, Alexander continued, his voice earnest. It's the freedom it represents. Claire, I know you're married and I respect that. But I also know what we felt, what we shared was real. I'm not asking you to leave your life, but perhaps to live another alongside it. The proposal was both exhilarating and terrifying. Alexander, what are you suggesting? She asked, her voice a whisper against the night. I'm suggesting a secret life, one where you can be who you truly are, not just the wife of Thomas. A life where you can explore, feel, and perhaps find a part of yourself you've long buried. The idea was seductive, a parallel existence where she could indulge in her desires without forsaking her responsibilities. Yet the implications were vast, the risks monumental. I need to think, she said, her mind racing with the possibilities and the dangers. I know, he replied, his hand still holding hers. But think quickly, Claire. Time is not on our side. The heart, once awakened, cannot be easily put back to sleep. They stood there, the city's pulse beating softly around them, the bridge a silent witness to their whispered confessions. The choice before her was stark. Continue down the path of propriety or step into the shadows with Alexander, where passion promised to burn bright, but could also consume her entirely. As they parted, the cool air of the night seemed to whisper secrets of its own, the river's gentle flow a reminder of the relentless passage of time. Claire walked back home, her steps heavy with the weight of her decision, knowing that whatever she chose, her life would never be the same. The following days were a tempest of emotions for Claire, each moment stretching into an eternity as she grappled with the decision that lay before her. The rain had ceased, leaving London in a state of eerie calm, the kind that precedes a storm. Her days were filled with the pretense of normalcy, but her nights were consumed by thoughts of Alexander, his words echoing in her mind like a siren's call. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold, Claire found herself at her writing desk, pen in hand. She hadn't written in years, but now the need to pour out her thoughts was overwhelming. She began to write, her words flowing like the Thames under the bridge where she had stood with Alexander. Asterisk, the heart, once awakened, cannot be easily put back to sleep. Asterisk. The phrase haunted her, a truth she couldn't escape. She sealed the letter with a wax stamp, her hands trembling slightly. It was addressed to Alexander, a confession of her turmoil, her longing, and her fear. That night, she slipped out again, the letter concealed in her cloak. The streets were quiet, the city holding its breath as if aware of the clandestine meeting about to unfold. She made her way to Alexander's modest home, the same path she had taken before, but now with a different purpose. The door opened before she could knock, Alexander's silhouette framed by the warm light from within. His eyes searched hers, a silent question hanging between them. "I've made my decision," Claire said, her voice steady despite the storm within. He stepped aside, allowing her entry. The room was as she remembered, filled with the scent of ink and leather, but tonight, it felt charged with anticipation. She handed him the letter, watching as he broke the seal with a reverence that made her heart ache. He read in silence, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he looked up, his gaze intense. "Claire," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "you've written of a life divided, of passion and duty. But what of your heart? What does it truly desire?" She took a deep breath, the weight of her choice pressing down on her. "My heart," she whispered, "wants to feel alive again, to experience the depth of emotion I've only tasted with you. But my mind, it fears the consequences, the pain it might bring to others." Alexander stepped closer, his hand reaching out to cup her cheek. "Life is pain, Claire. It's also joy, passion, and the unknown. What we share, it's real, it's raw. But I won't force you to choose between your life and this possibility of something more. You must choose, but know that I will respect your decision." Claire's eyes filled with tears, the conflict within her reaching its zenith. I choose to live, Alexander. I choose to embrace this part of me that has been dormant for so long." His face softened, relief washing over him like a wave. "Then let us not waste another moment," he said, pulling her into an embrace that felt like coming home. The decision was made, but the reality of what it meant began to settle in. They spent the night talking, planning, whispering promises and fears. The room around them seemed to shrink, the world outside fading into insignificance. As dawn approached, Claire knew she had to return home, to face the life she was leaving behind, if only in part. Alexander walked her to the door, their hands intertwined, a silent vow of their new pact. "I'll see you soon," she whispered, her voice a mix of determination and fear. "Very soon," he replied, his eyes holding hers with a promise of the future. The walk back to her home was fraught with the weight of her choice. The streets were beginning to stir, the first light of dawn casting long shadows that seemed to stretch towards her, a reminder of the path she had chosen. Upon entering her home, the familiar surroundings felt alien, as if she were a stranger in her own life. Thomas was already up, his voice echoing from the dining room, discussing business with his valet. Claire paused, her hand on the doorframe, the reality of her double life settling in. She joined him, her heart heavy with the secret she now carried. Thomas greeted her with a distracted smile, his mind on the day's affairs. "Good morning, my dear. I trust you slept well." "Yes, Thomas," she lied, her voice steady. "I had the most vivid dreams." The day unfolded with the usual routines, but Claire felt like an actor on a stage, playing a part she no longer fully inhabited. Her mind was with Alexander, the thrill of their clandestine meetings, the freedom she felt in his presence. As the week progressed, Claire and Alexander met in secret, their rendezvous filled with whispered conversations, stolen kisses, and the exploration of a love that was both exhilarating and forbidden. Each meeting was a risk, a dance on the edge of discovery, yet the passion between them only grew, fueled by the secrecy and the danger. One evening, as they lay together in the dim light of Alexander's study, the world outside forgotten, Claire's resolve was tested once more. "What if we're caught?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander turned to her, his eyes serious. "Then we face it together, Claire. We face the consequences with our heads held high, knowing we've chosen to live fully, if only for a moment." Claire nodded, her heart heavy yet resolute. "I understand," she said, her voice a mix of fear and determination. "But I must be careful. For both our sakes." Alexander kissed her forehead, a gesture of both comfort and farewell. "I know. And I'll be here waiting for you whenever you can come." The weeks turned into months, and Claire's life became a delicate balance of two worlds. By day, she was the dutiful wife, attending to her social duties with a grace that belied the storm within. By night, she was Alexander's muse, his lover, his secret. Each meeting was a stolen piece of time, a treasure she hoarded in her heart. But as time passed, the weight of her secret life began to wear on her. The thrill of the forbidden was tempered by the constant fear of discovery, the guilt of her deception, and the growing realization that her heart was split in two. One chilly autumn evening, as the leaves outside turned to gold and crimson, Claire sat at her vanity, her reflection showing a woman caught between two lives. Thomas entered, his presence a reminder of the life she had promised to uphold. "Claire," he said, his voice unusually gentle, "you seem different lately. Is everything all right?" She turned to him, her heart racing. Here was her chance to confess, to end the charade. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she smiled, a practiced, hollow smile. "I'm fine, Thomas. Just the change of seasons, I suppose." He nodded, but his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than usual, as if trying to see through the facade she had so carefully constructed. That night, as she lay beside Thomas, the silence between them was palpable. She could feel the distance growing, not just physically but emotionally. The passion she shared with Alexander was a stark contrast to the polite, distant affection she received from Thomas. The next morning, Claire made her decision. She couldn't continue this way. The risk of discovery, the pain of living a lie, it was too much. She penned a letter to Alexander, her hand shaking as she wrote. Alexander, I've cherished every moment with you, but I can't continue this path. My heart is torn, and I must find a way to mend it, to live with integrity. Please understand this isn't an end but a pause. Perhaps in another life, another time, we could have been free to love without shadows. Yours always, Claire. She sealed the letter, her heart aching with every stroke of the wax. That evening she delivered it herself, leaving it at his doorstep, unable to face him, to see the pain in his eyes. The days that followed were a blur of routine and regret. Claire threw herself into her duties, her social engagements, anything to fill the void Alexander's absence had left. But the emptiness persisted, a silent companion in her every waking moment. One evening, as she sat alone in the drawing room, the door opened, and there stood Alexander, the letter in his hand. His eyes were stormy, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a tempest of emotions. "Claire," he said, his voice raw, "I read your letter. I understand, but I had to see you to know if this is truly what you want." She stood, her heart pounding. "Alexander, it's not what I want, but what I must do. For my sanity, for Thomas, for us." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "But what about us, Claire? What about what we shared?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "It was real, Alexander. More real than anything I've known. But love isn't just passion. It's also sacrifice. I can't continue to live a lie." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Then this is goodbye?" "For now," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Perhaps one day, when the world allows, we might find each other again." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, a silent agreement passing between them. He leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that was both a farewell and a promise. Then, without another word, he turned and left, the door closing softly behind him. Claire stood there, the echo of his departure filling the room. She knew she had made the right choice, but the pain was undeniable. She returned to her seat, her gaze drifting to the window where the rain had started again. A soft, persistent reminder of the life she had chosen to leave behind. As the weeks turned into months, Claire found a new rhythm, a life of quiet duty and reflection. She began to write again, pouring her emotions into stories, finding solace in the written word. Her relationship with Thomas, while still distant, grew more honest, the space between them filled with a new understanding. And in her heart she kept Alexander not as a lover, but as a chapter of her life that taught her about passion, about the depth of human connection, and about the courage it takes to choose one's path, even when it leads away from what the heart desires most. The rain outside continued its relentless dance, but inside, Claire found a peace she hadn't known before. She had chosen her path, and though it was fraught with loss, it was hers. And in that choice she found a freedom of her own, a quiet, enduring love for the life she had decided to live. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment if you enjoyed this story. This will help us create more engaging stories for you.